Hi, I'm Joy. Good morning and good evening. My goal for this presentation is to build a strong connection between education for ecological civilization and the field environmental philosophy, and to convince some of you to join the research community for bioculture conservation. This presentation is much owed to Ricardo Rossi, who not only coined important terms and the methodology I'm using in this presentation, but also carries an ethicalness to examine ongoing communication and discourse in the academia, particularly his open-minded thinking about non-vascular plants and invertebrates in the ecological communication. As you can see, my presentation is structured like this. I try to explain the context that I carry out the research, the institutional platform of the proposal, the methodology I use, and also case studies to show the probability and the prospects of this research. But the more I investigate it, the stronger the feeling is that education for ecological civilization should not stay on papers or publications or be proposed as just a political propaganda or be regarded as a domestic issue particular to China. It should be handled as a common vision of education for global societies. It should get into the field. To explain why, I follow up two questions. First, how could field environmental philosophy and education for ecological civilization be mutually strengthened? To address the first question, I asked the very specific question, why was a tiger named 大虫, literally means big insect, and a snake named 长虫, literally means non-insect. It is an odd question. In modern Chinese, 虫 usually is translated into insects, bugs, or worms. In other words, 虫 in Chinese designates the invertebrates. 大虫, another name of tiger, becomes a literary heritage and sometimes a word in vernacular. For example, in the household story of the tiger hunter, Wu Song encountered a tiger face to face. In a situation whether to hunt or be preyed, he killed the tiger. In the story, the tiger as a predator was depicted as 吊睛白额锦毛大虫, the 8 Chinese words in red. And in its English translation, the 8 Chinese words present as 3 English words, a large tiger. Nothing is wrong. Surely it is a large tiger. The problem is just in this translation, much information has been taken out. Literally, the 8 Chinese words should be translated into a large 虫 with slanting eyes, white forehead, and golden hair. The translator will need a whole another paragraph to explain why the tiger is a large 虫 rather than just a large tiger if he chooses a literal translation. What's more, tigers got their various names in diversified literary works, as shown on this slide. So why 大虫? To answer this simple question, I reviewed the context of education for ecological civilization, which is the third stage of China's environmental education. The former two stages focused on environmental protection and sustainable development, which were incorporated into various levels of textbooks from elementary schools to universities, into publications and political propaganda. The first and the second stages were also responses to UN's Earth Summit in 1972 and 1992. Unfortunately, the first and the second stage of environmental education were not so productive because during the same period, China's top political agenda was economical development and against poverty. China stepped on the same routine of grow first and clean up nature as the rich countries in the north. However, the accumulation of environmental disasters and ecological catastrophes since the 1990s required to change the mindset. Serious concerns from environmental and economic accounting, philosophical conservation regarding the Western environmental movements, and many other concerns eventually led to the third stage of China's environmental education. Now, in the third stage, how to assure the efficacy of education for ecological civilization is in debate. There are many different proposals, for instance, to stay on the old routine as a long-term publicity, or to form an educational system, or add into the curriculum system, or start educational programs in pilot universities, or cooperate with informal educational institutions and organizations, etc. This slide shows the domestic publications regarding education for ecological civilization. The number has been climbing since 2012. Another slide shows the disciplinary distribution of education for ecological civilization in China's academic journals and the numbers of articles, the title of which contain the term education for ecological civilization. Given the contemporary scenario of the third stage, China's Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Ecology and Environment offered some guidance for education for ecological civilization, such as encourage interdisciplinary dialogues, develop curriculum and textbooks, design campus activities for behavioral change, and also integrate knowledge and action, etc. So why ecological civilization matters? Domestically, EC has become a national strategy for handling the ecological degradation, rebuilding China, aiming at the harmony and coexistence between people and nature. Philosophically, EC also offers a chance to examine the existing conception of the world, values, history, culture, civilization, and human nature relationship in the national level, and a possibility for the heritage of Chinese traditional philosophy contributing to the future of the planet. Internationally, EC as a socio-technical imaginary that integrates certain culture and moral values with technological and political goals could be a vision for a global future and encourage to abandon political inert in fighting against climate change. Now, field environmental philosophy has been introduced to China by several Chinese scholars. Zhang Wei and Lou Wenlong had done some work concerning field philosophy, and I have introduced the field environmental philosophy in publications and at various occasions. For people who are right now attending this panel, I assume that you are familiar with Ricardo's framework of four-step circle of field environmental philosophy and the 3H triangle of bioculture ethics. This slide shows how the 3Hs, namely co-inhabitants, habits, and habitats, are interrelated with great complexity. The left picture demonstrates that various ethnic groups interact with the hummingbird, and also the various names people invented, which carry rich bioculture information in the form of traditional ecological knowledge, narratives, and language. Likely on the right, it shows another example of the co-inhabitance among humans and other than human beings. To be specific, how people interact with a lichen in the Southern American temperate forest, which eventually led to the invention of the field activity of ecotourism with a hand lens. Now I turn to the Chinese traditional solar terms to explain the simple question I asked at the beginning. The 24 solar terms reflect close observation of Asian Chinese regarding natural phenomenon. By measuring the shadows of the object, Asian calendar staffs in the court found solutions to fundamental questions of the calendar, like how to set the beginning of the year and a day, or determine the solstice. Based on the data recorded in the old calendars and the 24 solar terms, it doesn't mean that Asian Chinese have formed a heliocentric model of the planet system, but rather the data match a heliocentric planetary system, and according to the data, the Earth apparently orbits around the Sun. Chinese philosophers understand how 24 terms represent the seasonal changes and the Earth's position in related to the Sun. They use a diagram in the E system to indicate the flux between yin and yang. For example, winter solstice is the moment that the strength of yang is coming back. The yang at the bottom of the diagram Fu. At least in Tang Dynasty, scholars have made it clear about this point. It matches the northern hemisphere's winter solstice that sun rays hit the Tropic of Capricorn and about to move to the equator. Antecedent comprehension of Fu has focused it as the mind of the heaven and the earth. It is a north-centered view. If we attend to the 24 solar terms in the table, we can see how Asian people observed and documented the phenomenological changes in nature. The 24 terms can be classified into categories like temperature change, precipitation, astronomical events, philological phenomena, and farming. I pick up the third term, awakening of insects, or Jinzhe, to exemplify the biocultural significance of the 24 solar terms. A mining of this term also answers the question I asked at the beginning. Awakening of insects usually matches one of the 3 days in a year. It could be March the 5th, or the 6th, or the 7th, marking the beginning of the mid-spring season. Last year, it began on March the 5th and ended on March the 20th. The two Chinese words meaning differently. Jin means awakening, Zhe designates hibernated insects. The right picture shows roughly the corresponding period of the 24 solar terms. During the season of Jinzhe, insects coming forth informs the beginning of the spring farming. In other words, various farming activities as the habits of humans are connected to the habit of insects. On this slide, it shows 2 of the earliest records of Jinzhe in 2 classical literatures, which are probably written during the various states of a period, BC 475 to 221. The first source indicates first movement of insects and other related phenomena in nature. As it goes, the east winds resolve the cold. Worms and insects that have been torpid during the winter begin to move. The fishes rise up to the ice. Otters sacrifice fish. The wind geese make their appearance. The second source records the coming force, not just insect in motion. And apparently, human habits are suggested to adjust based on what is going on in nature. The literature also records the life cycle and habits of insects in the entire year, from begin to move to scaly, come forth, all the way to appear in monstrous form. The records are a piece of direct evidence that ancient people are adept at observing and documenting the changes in nature, and they adjust their habits according to the change. From my understanding, these habits indicate that they have a closer contact with nature than we do today. This slide shows other classical literature which contain information about the 24 solar terms in different time. The last source, Philology, was written by Zhu Kezhen, who graduated from University of Illinois and obtained his PhD from Harvard University. He had combined modern philology, meteorology, and the 24 solar terms in his writing. Now I want to show you the evolution of etymological glimpse of the Chinese word insect or 虫. On the slide are words appeared on oracle bone, bronze, bamboo, and wooden snips, and a second century Chinese dictionary, and the regular script since Eastern Han Dynasty. Two variants are mostly used in classical literatures. The glimpse might have something to do with the morphological features of worms and insects that people observe. Not only the words of insects have a history, as we can see on the former slide. Insects also appear in many metaphors in Chinese language, and most of them we still use to communicate today. Some metaphors indicate philosophical thoughts on a particular issue, like when Zhuangzi dreamed a butterfly, or whether it is possible to communicate with a summer insect about the ice, etc. In this regard, the Silk Road is no longer just a culture route, it is a bioculture route, or a culture route that carries biological and ecological significance. The records of the habits of insects also indicate the ethical admonishment regarding human habits. The parallel to bioculture ethics of co-inhabitants among humans and others in human beings. The prohibitions against cutting down trees, throwing down nests, etc. reveal how Asian people venerate the fecundity of the earth, both in mentality and practices. This obedience to those ethical and ecological principles brings ecological catastrophes. That is a teaching about how human habits generate ecological consequence. As it says here, if the emperor is fond of destroying the nest and eggs, the phoenix would not fly. That basically means if the emperor does not follow those principles and shows no respect to the fecundity of the earth, ecological disasters like storms, floods, droughts, death of people, perishing of the 5 grains, abortion of the 6 domestic animals would happen. And secret birds, reptiles, mammals would no longer appeal due to irresponsible ecological governing. This also answers my question at the beginning. Why was a tiger named Dachong and a snake Changchong? Because in ancient China, Chong is a word to designate all animals. The first part of this quote here tells us that Asian people classified all Chong into 5 categories, namely feathered, hairy, shelled, scaled, and naked. We call those Chong today as birds, mammals, reptiles, aquatic animals, and humans. Now it is, I guess, comprehensible that a tiger is a big chong and a snake is a long chong when chong designate war animals. Now you might have another question to ask. When the word chong begin to designate only insects, worms, and bugs, I will leave this question for future. Anyway, I think I have partly addressed the second question, and the following 2 slides are artworks of Chong. The first by artist Shan Ze, published in 2018, and the second by artist Lin Hai, published in 2019. Now I'm about to wrap up the presentation. First, although in modern Chinese, chong meaning refers to invertebrates such as worms, insects, and bugs, according to some of the earliest classical literature, the term actually has designated vertebrates like birds, reptiles, mammals, aquatic animals, and humans. This antique meaning has been saved in vernacular and some traditional genres of literal works. Second, as demonstrated by the presentation, the 24 sonar terms, exemplified by awakening of insects, disclose rich bioculture information. Based on the 4-step circle of field environmental philosophy, we should carry more research on those sonar terms, mine the bioculture heritage not only in those terms, but also in other forms, in other regions and nations, to make a bioculture heritage meaningful in contemporary bioculture conservation, and design field activity to convey bioculture message to global citizens. I believe while encounter the global socio-ecological cultural crisis, what really matters is the ethical decision we make at this point. That is all for my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.